Hello, my name is Mohammed. I'm going to present you my thesis with the title of Vibration-Based Damage Detection in Laminated Composite Beam using Spectral Finite Element Method and Genetic Algorithm. This work was done under the supervision of Dr. Erkman from the BCE department and Dr. Gannison from the MIAE department. So at first, I'm going to talk about the motivation behind our work and the problems that we identified and offered a solution for them. Then I will talk about the spectral finite element method, which is the main analysis approach that we adopted. Then we will move on to the vibration-based damage detection tool that we implemented based on the genetic algorithm that is connected to the spectral analysis program and uses its output to perform structural health monitoring. Composite structures offer an advantage for structures which require a combination of high strength and low weight. In contrast to their in-plane properties, transverse tensile and interlaminar shear strength of laminated composite beams are quite low. Consequently, laminated composite beams are prone to delamination from a wide variety of sources, such as fabrication stresses, environmental cycling, handling damages, etc. Delamination not only affects the strength and integrity of the structure by contributing to its final failure, but also causes a reduction in the stiffness, thus affecting its vibration characteristics. However, we can use this effect on vibration properties to detect the delamination. The figure on this slide shows the effect of delamination on natural frequencies of different modes of vibration of a delaminated composite beam, taken from a study done in 1997 done by Pardue and Tracy. So the x-axis shows the location of delamination and the y-axis shows the change in the frequency. It is observed that the delamination affects higher modes of vibration much more significantly than lower ones. This means that it makes the frequency of the lower modes will be affected, higher modes will be affected much more. Capturing higher modes of vibration using conventional finite elements needs a very fine mesh that leads to high computational cost. Damage detection algorithm needs to repeat the analysis for many different damage cases. So this will lead to a very huge computational cost. Spectral finite element method, however, uses frequency-dependent shape functions that are flexible enough to capture higher modes of vibration. This motivated us to adopt spectral finite element for our modeling. The scope of the thesis is kept to linear and elastic vibration of beams. Only symmetric laminated composite beams are considered in which the bending and axial behavior are uncoupled. For the delamination modeling, symmetric composite beams with mid-plane delamination are considered. The damage detection algorithm is capable of locating one-point single damage cases. The global objective of the thesis is to propose a computationally efficient damage detection algorithm based on high-frequency analysis for the laminated composite beams. In order to achieve this purpose, the following steps were taken. Spectral finite element method is adopted to model the vibration of laminated composite beams. The transient response is added to the results obtained from frequency domain analysis. A delamination model to capture the effect of interface friction is proposed. The vibration-based damage detection algorithm based on the developed analysis program using genetic algorithm is developed. The first problem that we identified was that the transient solution was missing from the frequency domain analysis. We looked for solutions in the literature and the explanations about the effect of initial conditions were confusing. We adopted the method suggested in Belotzos and Kumar to calculate the transient response based on the steady-state solution that can be obtained from spectral finite element method. The Whitlock-Williams algorithm was adopted to search for natural frequencies. For vibration of simple structures where closed form solution is available, the Whitlock-Williams algorithm works very well. However, we identified that for more complex structures, such as unsymmetric laminated composite beams, the original method cannot be used since there is no analytical solution available. So we implemented a method that does not need the closed form solution. Due to numerical issues, we could not make this method work, and we kept the scope of the thesis limited to symmetric laminated composites. We use multiple point constraint method to model delamination. However, this approach does not capture the effect of friction between the interface of the top and bottom layers in the delaminated zone. So we use the spring elements in the delaminated zone to represent the friction effect. So the advantage of the spectral finite element analysis over the conventional finite element is that the spectral finite element method considers the exact mass distribution. This is because the shape functions that are used to create the stiffness matrix are derived from dynamic form of the equation of motion. The figure on the left here gives an overview of the steps involved in spectral finite element method. So at first, the input force is replaced by the spectral form obtained from the Fourier transform to determine the frequency content. Then the problem is solved in the frequency domain to obtain the output also in the frequency domain. So the displacement of degrees of freedom are calculated in the frequency domain. And finally, the response is reconstructed in the time domain using the inverse Fourier transform. Vibration of a symmetric laminated composite beam can be treated as the uncoupled vibration of an isotropic beam and a bar, since the coupled bending axial terms are removed from the differential equation of motion in a symmetric case. So we just need to calculate the equivalent material properties and model it with a frame element. Partial differential equation of motion of an Euler-Bernoulli beam is shown in equation 1. So in the equation 1, EI is the flexural stiffness, V is the transverse displacement, and M is the mass per unit length. Transverse displacement can be written as a function of time times a function of space. So if you plug that in to the differential equation, that leads to the characteristic equation, which its roots are the wave numbers that indicate possible forms of deformation. Transverse displacement is obtained as a linear combination of these wave numbers, and rotation in a Euler-Bernoulli beam is the derivative of the transverse displacement, so it can be obtained very easily. The spectral beam element has 2 nodes and 2 degrees of freedom on each, which are transverse displacement and rotation. Nodal values of degrees of freedom are obtained from the equation in the previous slide. So nodal forces are calculated according to equation 8, which shows the force displacement equations. The matrix that relates nodal forces to nodal degrees of freedom is called the dynamic stiffness matrix, which is the function of frequency. So the same procedure can be followed for the spectral bar formulation. The displacement field, which this time is the axial displacement only, is rewritten as a function of time times the function of space, as shown in equation 12. A harmonic shape is assumed for the axial deformation at each frequency, as shown in equation 14. And nodal forces and nodal displacements are related to each other using the dynamic stiffness matrix, as shown on equation 16 at the bottom. So we did a case study and tried to get the response of a simply supported beam under 2 different load cases using a spectral finite element method. So the beam is made of aluminum with material properties shown on the left, and the length of the beam is 60 inches. The first applied load is a step load, which is applied at the middle point of the beam as a concentrated force. Figure 5 at the bottom right of the screen shows the transverse displacement of the beam, of the middle point of the beam, which is obtained from a model that has 2 spectral elements. The response is shown by blue and is compared with the steady-state analytical solution, which is shown by orange. And we can see great agreement between the 2 steady-state solutions. The same procedure is repeated for sine load cases with different frequencies ranging from 1 to 6 hertz. And as you could see, the results obtained from the spectral element matches the analytical solution. However, the interesting observation here is that the captured response follows the frequency of the load. While we know that for undamped vibration, we should observe a response that is in the frequency of the structure as well. So we realized that the transient part was missing and tried to offer a solution for it. So consider the undamped vibration of a single degree of freedom system under sine load. This response can be obtained either directly by solving the differential equation that is shown in equation 18, or by using the Duhamel's integral that is shown in equation 19. So if we compare these equations, we see that the Duhamel's integral has 2 terms. One is in the frequency of the load, the other follows the frequency of the structure. So we can break the integral by changing its limits. So we can have an integral that's from 0 to infinity minus another integral that's from t to infinity, and this is shown in equation 21. So the integral that's from 0 to infinity is what is captured by spectral element method, and the integral from t to infinity is not captured, and that should be added. So Velocis and Kumar offered the solution to calculate the transient response based on the steady-state response. So on the screen, y is the steady-state response, x is the complete response under the and the difference is shown by the corrective function epsilon. So all x, y, and epsilon can be represented as mode in terms of modes of vibration and their modal coordinates. So the modal coordinates of the corrective function epsilon which are shown with alpha, can be calculated if we have we can be calculated based on equation 27. And we need to have the mass matrix of the system, natural frequencies and mode shapes, and the initial conditions of vibration. So we need to calculate the natural frequencies. So to determine the natural frequencies, the conventional finite element method is to create the stiffness matrix and the mass matrix of the system and solve a linear eigenvalue problem, as shown in equation 27. So the spectral finite element method considers the effect of mass and the stiffness in the one matrix that is called the dynamic stiffness. This leads to what is called in the literature the transcendental eigenvalue problem that needs a different treatment. So Wittig-Williams offered the solution to calculate the natural frequencies using the dynamic stiffness matrix. Their method is based on equation 29 that counts the number of natural frequencies of the structure that are exceeded by certain value that's shown here by omega star, which is the trial frequency. J of omega star is the frequency count. J0 is the number of natural frequencies of the structure that are less than omega star. And that are less than omega star when all of the degrees of freedom are fixed. And the last term on the equation 29 is the Stein count of the dynamic stiffness matrix. The Stein count is the number of negative values on the diagonal of the stiffness matrix when we make it up as triangular. So there are analytical solutions available for J0 for the cases of isotropic beams and bars, and that's what's adopted in this study. However, for unsymmetric laminated composite cases, no analytical solution is available. So we implemented a method to calculate J0 directly from the dynamic stiffness matrix, and I mentioned that in the beginning of my presentation, but we did not cover it in the thesis since we kept our scope to symmetric cases because of numerical problems. The lamination is assumed to cover the entire width of the beam in this study. The top and bottom layers in the laminated zone are treated as two composite beam elements as shown in the figure. So they need to be symmetric as well. The sublaminate element nodes are located at the midplane of the sublaminate. The kinematic assumption here is that at the interface of the sublaminate and base laminate, the cross-section remains plane and the slope is continuous and constant at the interface. So these assumptions are shown at the bottom, and they are applied using MPC matrix to our stiffness matrix. So all these are used to create an analysis program that was a collaboration between me and Dr. Erfman. So this program is written in Fortran and consists of many modules. So first, the inputs such as coordinate, material properties, etc., are read from a file. The global dynamic stiffness matrix is created. Natural frequencies and mode shapes are captured using Wittig-Williams module. If a response is needed to be calculated, then the sampling frequency, number of data points, and the force function are given as an input. Fast Fourier transform is performed on the input force, and the displacement of the nodes are calculated in frequency domain and are brought back to time domain using inverse Fourier transform. The transient response is calculated using the Lotsos method when we have the steady state response, and it is stored in a file. Now let's discuss our case studies. So in this slide, the effect of mesh refinement and natural frequencies obtained from conventional finite element model is shown. So the same simply supported beam that we discussed earlier that was made of aluminum is modeled using conventional finite element beams. The number of elements used in the model are increased and natural frequencies of the first four modes of vibration are calculated. So on the figures, the y-axis shows the obtained frequencies and the x-axis shows the number of elements used in the model. So it is seen that as we increase the number of elements, the obtained frequency converges to the correct value. The convergence rate becomes slower as we consider higher modes of vibration. Now let's look at the table that shows these results in a better way. So as you see, as we increase the number of elements from left to the right, the results converge to the analytical solution that are shown on the left, and this convergence rate drops as we go for higher modes, like the last row. But for the case that we used two spectral elements, that was enough to capture the exact analytical solution for all the modes. So this slide shows the results obtained from adding the transient response to the response of the simply supported beam that we saw earlier, which was under step and sine loads. So the transverse displacement of the middle point of the simply supported beam under a step load and the sine load with the frequency of 1 Hertz are obtained using a model with two spectral elements, and they're shown in blue, and the analytical solution is shown in orange. And as you can see, they agree very well. In this slide, the natural frequencies of a symmetric laminated composite beam are shown. The composite beam has 8 layers, and the stacking sequence is shown on the second row of the table at the top, and the material properties and geometrical properties are given. So this is the cantilever beam. And it is modeled using one spectral element, and its first four natural frequencies are captured and are compared with previous studies. As you can see, they show very close agreement with each other. Another laminated composite beam with simply supported boundary conditions is considered. So the stacking sequence now is different. This is shown at the top. It is 4 layers, and the material properties and geometrical properties are also given. The obtained natural frequencies are shown in the table and on the right, and they're compared with the results obtained from previous studies, and it shows a good agreement. All right, so on this slide, we have the same laminated composite beam that we had in slide 24, but this time with in example 1. But this time we have a delamination inside. So 3 different delamination sizes are considered, and the natural frequencies are obtained using spectral finite element modeling. So this time, 4 spectral finite element models are used as shown in the screen to model the delaminated beam. The results of this modeling are shown in table 4, 5, and 6. And you can see for different delamination sizes, like 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, and 15 centimeters, they match very closely with what was achieved in the studies. So on this slide, the effect of midplane delamination location on natural frequencies of the first 8 modes of vibration of a delaminated composite beam that we saw earlier in the previous slide are considered. So a delamination with the length of 4 centimeters is moved along the length of the beam. And you can see as it moves, the net frequency of the first 8 modes are plotted. And you can see how it will affect different modes. So on this slide, the relative change in the frequency of the first 8 modes due to delamination are calculated for different delamination cases. As the delaminated element moves along the length of the beam, the percentage of relative change in the frequency of the beams are plotted. The maximum value of the relative change for each mode, which would be the maximum values in these figures, are captured, and they're compared with each other in the next slide. So as you can see in figure 12, the x-axis shows the mode number and the y-axis shows the maximum relative change in frequencies, which were taken from the figures shown in the previous slide. So it is shown that higher modes of vibration are affected much more significantly, something around 12%, while lower modes were affected less than 1% by the delamination. In our delamination modeling, the effect of distributed contact between the delaminated surfaces at the top and bottom was not considered. So the objective of this slide is to add the additional effect due to the distributed contact at the delaminated zone, comprising of contact of chopped fibers and matrix in that area. So conventional spring elements with the stiffness in both X and Y directions are used to connect the top and bottom layers in the delaminated zone. Determining the exact distance of this matrix is beyond the scope of the thesis. However, these spring elements can represent the behavior of chopped fibers between the top and bottom layers. In order to show these springs can represent the friction effect, rigid MPC links are used for a case that the stiffness of the spring becomes very large. And this should make the behavior, and the idea is that if we increase the number of MPC links, the behavior of the beam should go toward a fully bonded case. To illustrate the performance of this modeling, the same delaminated cantilever beam discussed earlier is assumed to have a delamination that covers its entire length. The top and bottom layers are connected to each other with 1, 2, and 3 MPC links as shown on the left, and 1, 2, and 3 spring elements as shown on the right are created, and their natural frequencies are calculated. So when we connect the top and bottom layers using rigid MPC links, we see that as we increase the number of links in the delaminated zone, the natural frequencies of the first 3 modes of the beam get closer and closer to the fully bonded case. It is observed that the frequencies of the lower modes have a higher convergence rate to a fully bonded case. If we relax these constraints by replacing the rigid MPC links with the spring elements, we can represent the effect of interface friction in a better sense. In table 8, the first 3 natural frequencies of the beam on the top right are shown, which has 1 spring element in between the delaminated zone. As the stiffness of this spring increases, the natural frequencies get closer and closer to the case that we had 1 MPC link, 1 rigid MPC link in between the top and bottom layer. So the same observation is repeated for cases with 2 and 3 spring elements. So it's increasing the stiffness of these springs causes the natural frequencies to get closer to the case that we had the MPC links, the same number of MPC links. By increasing the number of springs and adjusting their stiffness, it is possible to represent the effect of interface friction. However, this discretization undermines the idea of using spectral finite elements method. So, the better solution could be inserting a spectral spring element instead of a conventional spring. But this is beyond the scope of the thesis, and we did not have enough time to pursue that. So now let's discuss the damage detection algorithm that we implemented in Python. 2 models were used to introduce damage in our structure. For the case of isotropic damage element case, damage can be inserted inside the beam at a certain location, at a certain length, with a certain damage index that shows the amount of change in the stiffness due to damage. And for the case of the delaminated beam, a delamination can be introduced at a certain location with a certain length. The purpose of the damage detection tool is to build a model that matches the observed frequencies from a vibration test as close as possible. Obviously, there are many possible combinations of locations and lengths to insert a damaged element inside the model. So for each trial structure, natural frequencies and mode shifts are calculated and put inside the cost function at the top. The cost function is a metric that shows how close our model is to the real structure and considers the relative difference in frequencies and mode shapes. Since mode shapes are vectors, Mach value or the modal assurance criterion is used to compare the mode shapes. So for each trial structure, a spectral finite element model is built and its stiffness matrix is generated, and using the Dietrich-Williams method, its eigenvalues and eigenvectors are found and compared with measured frequencies and mode shapes, and the cost value is found. So the closest model is to the real structure is the one that minimizes the cost function. So this turns our problem to a minimization problem. The objective function is to minimize the cost function in the previous slide. It is subject to certain constraints, like the length of the damage can't be larger than the length of the beam, or damage index can't be less than 0 or larger than 1. So figure 13 shows the value of the cost function for all possible trial structures for a certain damage case. And the purpose is to find the minimum of this cost function to find the closest model. So genetic algorithm is used to do the minimization. Genetic algorithm starts from random points in our optimization space and builds better solution as it evolves. Each damage case is shown within the damage location, is shown with the damage location, damage length, and damage index. Or for the laminated case, the damage case is shown with the damage location and damage length. So the flow of the genetic algorithm that was implemented in Python is shown in this figure. A generation of 8 possible damage structures are created randomly inside the constraints of the problem. So this is our first generation of solutions, and it's completely random. The spectral finite element model of each solution is built, and natural frequencies and mode shapes are captured. The cost function for each candidate solution is calculated, and the solutions are ranked and sorted based on how close they are to the real structure, which means having a lower cost. The first 2 best solutions are sent directly to the next generation. A pair of solutions are picked randomly based on the rank in the generation, and crossover is performed on these pairs, and the new pair of solutions are created and sent to the next generation. And the crossover process is shown in the figure. So this is repeated until a generation is created. The new generation go through mutation that randomly and with a certain probability picks one of the elements in the solution and changes it from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. This is to avoid getting stuck in the local minimums. So this process produces generations with better solutions. The process stops when the number of generations reaches a certain limit, or when the cost function of the best solution present in the current generation becomes less than a certain threshold. So the performance of the genetic algorithm is shown for a case of a delaminated composite beam. So it is the same delaminated beam that was used in the previous case study. The delamination location is 100 millimeters, and the length of the delamination is 20 millimeters. And you can see that the figure shows the delaminated case on the top left. That's the target that we are trying to find. And the animation playing at the bottom left of the screen shows the evolutionary performance of the genetic algorithm. So you could see that it starts from a far away location, and it gets so let's watch it again. Okay, now starts from a far away location, it jumps to the close one. That's probably something that mutation does, and finds it. So the figure 15 at the bottom right shows the value of the cost function for the best candidate in each generation. So after 28 generations, the genetic algorithm was able to find the exact location and length of the delamination. So the same procedure is repeated for detecting damage in an isotropic beam. So consider the simply supported aluminum beam that we talked about with a damaged element located at 20 inches and a length of 5 inches with 25% drop in its stiffness. The genetic algorithm was able to locate its location somewhere around the 350th generation, and this takes much more generations because we have a damage index that can be vary from 0 to 100 and multiply our possible cases by 100. So the new aspects studied in the delamination effect in this study are first the application of spectral finite element method to study the effect of delamination on higher modes of vibration was proposed. Then we proposed a new model to capture interface friction in the delaminated area using the spring elements, and also the spectral finite element method as the analysis tool was used to perform frequency-based delamination detection. So overall, the application of a spectral finite element method as a computational efficient tool for dynamic analysis of laminated composites was studied. The transient response was added to the results obtained from frequency domain analysis, and the vibration-based damage detection algorithm based on genetic algorithm was developed to show the application of spectral finite element method. The main contributions of this thesis to the field are addition of the transient response to the response obtained from spectral finite element method, proposing a model to capture delamination and interface friction in the delaminated zone, and also proposing a frequency-based delamination detection algorithm based on the spectral finite element model. So research topics that can be worked on based on what we built in our thesis could be development of a spectral finite element model for unsymmetric laminated composite beams, and development of a spectral spring element to avoid discretization in the delaminated zone to capture the friction effect, and development of a data-driven approach to improve the performance of the damage detection algorithm when real data obtained from experimental vibration tests are used. We presented our work in the CSC 2021 conference back in May 2021, and we are thinking of writing a journal paper to pursue one of the topics that we listed in the future works. Here's a list of the references, and thank you very much.